I can still recall the exact moment it all changed, like a sudden electric shock that pierced through the tranquility of the night. We were seated on the porch of her lake house, the gentle lapping of the water echoing in the distance, and the stars twinkling faintly above us. There was nothing about that evening that hinted it would alter everything. Yet, without a second thought, I reached over and touched her hand. This wasn't just a casual touch. It carried intention. My fingers grazed her skin, and I felt her freeze in place. For a brief moment I thought she would withdraw, but she remained still. Her hand stayed right where it was, and she looked at me, not with confusion or discomfort, but with something different, something I hadn't witnessed in her eyes before. I can't explain what compelled me to do it. Perhaps it was the weeks we'd spent together or the prolonged silence that turned something familiar into the unknown. In that instant, everything I had meticulously tried to avoid thinking about came crashing down. Yes, she was my aunt, but that fact suddenly felt irrelevant. The boundaries had blurred, and we were teetering on the brink of something perilous. I should have stopped. I should have retracted my hand and let the evening conclude right there. But I didn't. Neither did she. And in that shared silence, we both understood this wasn't just a fleeting mistake. It marked the beginning of something irreversible. The next morning felt different. Everything had shifted, even though nothing was spoken. We both acted as if the prior night hadn't transpired, as if my hand hadn't lingered on hers longer than it ought to have. Mornings at the lake house were typically quiet, filled with the sounds of coffee brewing and birds chirping outside the window. But now, a thick and uncomfortable silence stretched between us. We fell into our routines. She prepared breakfast while I tidied up the porch. Normally, we would chat and joke about trivial matters, but not today. Each movement and glance was charged with an invisible tension. I sensed it, and I knew she did too. After breakfast, we ventured outside to tend to the garden, an activity we had shared ever since I started staying with her. It was one of the few things that allowed us to keep busy without having to engage in too much conversation. The sun was already high, and I could feel its warmth on my back as I worked on the weeds around the old oak tree. She was nearby, kneeling in the soil, tugging at the roots of some stubborn plants. I stole glances at her, but she never looked up. An hour drifted by in near silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the sound of tools scraping against the earth. I felt like I was losing my sanity, the weight of what had transpired pressing heavily on me. I wanted to say something to clear the air, but the words were lodged in my throat. Instead, I poured myself into my work, trying to sweat out the confusion as the heat became overwhelming. I stood up and wiped the sweat from my forehead. "Do you want some water?" I called out to her. She nodded, still avoiding my gaze. I walked over to the porch, retrieved 2 bottles from the cooler, and returned. I handed one to her, and for the first time that day our fingers brushed again as she took it. She froze, and so did I. The memory of last night hit me hard. There was a beat of silence, and then, without thinking, I stepped closer. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe for her to pull away or tell me to stop. But she didn't. Instead, she finally looked up at me, and in her eyes, I saw it again. That same hesitation, that familiar feeling from the night before. "Lila." My voice barely rose above a whisper, but I knew she heard me. I swallowed hard, uncertain about what to say next or what was right anymore. I don't know what's happening here." Her lips parted, and she exhaled softly, glancing down at the water bottle in her hands, her fingers tightening around it. "Neither do I," she admitted quietly, almost too softly for me to hear. That should have been the end of it. We should have walked away, halted whatever was unfolding before it escalated further. Yet, instead, I took another step closer, closing the gap between us. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, and every part of me screamed that this was wrong, that I needed to stop, but I didn't. She remained still, her eyes wide as she tried to decipher what to do or say. But nothing came out. The sun bore down on us, making everything feel surreal, as if we were trapped in a dream we couldn't escape. Then, before I could reconsider, I leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't planned. I hadn't thought it through. It just happened. as if some invisible force was drawing me to her. My lips brushed against hers, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. I expected her to push me away, to break the moment, but she didn't. Instead, she kissed me back. It was brief, almost hesitant, but it was enough. When I pulled away, we were both breathing heavily, the reality of what we had just done crashing down on me like a freight train. I took a step back, staring at her in disbelief. What the hell had I just done? She didn't speak. She merely gazed at me, her expression a mix of shock and something I couldn't quite identify. A long, heavy silence enveloped us, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I wanted to apologize, to say it was a mistake, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she slowly stood up, brushing dirt off her knees, and without looking at me, turned and walked back toward the house. I watched her retreat, my heart racing in my chest. The tension that had been building between us for weeks had finally shattered, and now there was no turning back. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me standing there alone in the sweltering afternoon sun, bewildered by how everything had spiraled so quickly out of control. That night, the atmosphere in the house felt heavier than usual following the kiss. Neither of us had uttered a word. Lila had retreated inside, and I remained in the garden for what felt like hours, grappling with the reality of it all. I was still reeling from the sensation of her lips against mine and the fact that she hadn't pulled away. I realized we had crossed a boundary, but I had no clue how to go back. Perhaps, on some level, I didn't even want to. Eventually, I made my way inside, long after darkness enveloped the sky. The house was silent, the only illumination coming from the lamp in the living room. Lila sat on the couch, her gaze lost in the night outside the window. When I walked in, she didn't turn to look at me, and for a moment, I wondered if she even noticed my presence. I hesitated, unsure of my next move, my heart still racing from what had transpired earlier. Clearing my throat, I said, "Lila." Her name felt awkward in the stillness. I struggled to find the right words. After a moment, she finally glanced at me, and for the first time since that kiss, I noticed something in her eyes that was hard to pin down. Was it guilt? Fear? Or perhaps something else entirely? I couldn't be certain anymore. The tension between us hadn't dissipated. If anything, it felt more intense, tightening like a noose with each passing second. "I'm sorry," I offered, although the words felt meaningless. What was I apologizing for? The kiss? The emotions that led to it? The unspoken understanding that this was no mere mistake? She shook her head and turned her attention back to the window. Please don't apologize. Ethan, we both know it wasn't just your fault." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. She wasn't laying all the blame on me, but that didn't ease the weight of the situation. I stepped closer, uncertain about where this conversation was headed, and whether I even wanted to explore it. Lila rose slowly, as if carrying the burden of everything we hadn't said. She moved to the window, her back facing me. "What are we doing?" she whispered, her voice barely above the ambient sounds of the house. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, grasping for something to say that would help clarify our situation. But nothing made sense anymore. The kiss had shattered the fragile normalcy we'd held on to. I took a deep breath and shared the only truth I felt. "I don't know." After a long silence, she turned to me. Her eyes looked weary, filled with a sadness that made my chest ache. "Ethan, we can't keep pretending this isn't real." I wanted to argue, to insist that we could sweep it all under the rug and return to our previous routine. Yet I knew deep down that she was right. We had passed that point. The kiss had irrevocably altered everything. She took a step closer, her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt that same magnetic pull from earlier in the garden. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to resist. My heart raced as she advanced, her gaze unwavering. And then, just like that moment before, it happened again. This time, it wasn't impulsive or hasty. It was slow and deliberate. She reached up, her fingers grazing my cheek, and then her lips found mine once more. This kiss felt different, gentler, more assured. It was as though we both understood the gravity of our actions. There was no uncertainty, no fear, just the two of us in that softly lit room, the outside world fading into oblivion. I kissed her back, my hands resting lightly on her waist. In that moment, everything else faded away. All the confusion and doubts slipped from my mind. It was simply her and me, intertwined in a way that felt both inevitable and wrong. With each passing second, it felt as if we were sinking deeper into a situation we couldn't control. When we finally broke apart, she gazed up at me, her expression inscrutable. I was at a loss for words. Part of me wanted to apologize again, to retreat and pretend we hadn't just crossed yet another line. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to. The connection between us was too potent now, too authentic. She stepped back, running a hand through her hair, looking more exposed than I had ever seen her. "What do we do now?" Her voice was soft, almost timid, as if she feared the answer. I swallowed hard, realizing that whatever lay ahead wouldn't be simple. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me. "But we can't. We can't keep this up." Tears filled her eyes, and she quickly averted her gaze, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I know." The silence that followed was suffocating. I had no idea how to mend this, how to take back what we had done. And maybe I didn't even want to. That was the scariest part. She turned away again, staring out the window, and I felt the chasm between us widening, even though we stood only a few feet apart. The kiss had drawn us closer, but now it felt like it was tearing us apart in ways I hadn't anticipated. "I think," she hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think we need to figure this out separately." Her words struck me like a blow to the stomach. I knew she was right, yet the idea of leaving, of creating space between us, felt unbearable. But what choice did we have? We couldn't continue pretending that nothing had changed. We couldn't keep playing this risky game. I nodded, even though every part of me screamed to tell her no, to suggest we could solve this together. But I couldn't bring myself to say it. I didn't know what the right path forward was anymore. The following days became a blur. Lila and I spoke very little, and when we did, it was brief and stilted, the kind of conversations that highlighted the silence hanging in the air. I went through the motions of daily life, working around the house, helping in the garden, fixing minor things that didn't really require attention. Anything to avoid sitting idle, anything to keep from thinking about what had happened. She maintained her distance. I noticed how carefully she navigated around me, how she found reasons to leave the room if I lingered too long. This was unlike her. Lila had always been forthright, always willing to say what needed saying, even when it was uncomfortable. But now, there was only the weight of unspoken words between us. Each time our paths crossed, I felt that same pull, that confusing blend of guilt, desire, and something else I couldn't name. I could see it in her eyes, too. She was attempting to hide it, but it was there, just beneath the surface. I wondered if she was grappling with the same turmoil I was, that ongoing struggle between the desire to revert to the past and the knowledge that we couldn't was exhausting. It was one of those lengthy, quiet afternoons when everything finally reached its breaking point. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light through the living room windows. I was seated at the table, sifting through old papers, trying to appear occupied. Lila had been out for most of the day, avoiding the house, avoiding me. But when she finally returned, I sensed a shift in the atmosphere. She walked in without a word, dropping her bag by the door. I caught a glimpse of her from the corner of my eye, pretending to concentrate on the documents in front of me. She moved around the kitchen with a deliberate slowness, as if she was weighing every step she took. Eventually, she stopped, resting her hands on the counter, taking a deep breath. "Ethan," she began, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. "We need to talk." I shut the folder in front of me, my heart racing. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "I know." She didn't move or look at me. "I've been thinking about it, about us." Those words hung in the air, and I was unsure how to react. Us? Did that even exist anymore? I wasn't certain, but her hesitant tone indicated she felt the same uncertainty. Finally, she turned to face me, and I noticed something in her eyes that took me by surprise. A vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "What happened between us?" she asked, pausing as if choosing her words with care. "It wasn't just a mistake, was it?" I shook my head, unable to voice my thoughts. It hadn't been a mistake in the conventional sense, but it wasn't right either. We both understood that, yet I couldn't articulate it. Lila stepped closer, her arms crossed over her chest as if trying to shield herself from the weight of our conversation. "I've been trying to figure it out," she continued, her voice softer now. "What this means and what we should do next." I leaned back in my chair, my fingers nervously tapping on the table. "Anne?" I prompted, sensing the tension building. "I don't know," she admitted, locking her eyes with mine. "I thought I would by now, but I don't." The atmosphere in the room was almost suffocating. I yearned to reach out and bridge the gap between us, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear or the crushing reality that what had happened between us was irreversible. "I think we're both lost in this," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling under the weight of all that remained unspoken. "I don't know what to do either." She let out a shaky breath and took a seat across from me. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at one another, both at a loss for words. It was as if we stood on opposite sides of a vast canyon, too far apart to touch but too close to ignore the chasm that lay between us. "I wish I could take it back," she murmured. Her words pierced me, but I understood she didn't mean it as pure regret. It was more about the consequences we now faced. "I don't," I replied, surprising myself with the honesty of my statement. "I don't wish that." She looked at me, and I could see the inner conflict reflected in her eyes. She didn't want to admit it, but she felt the same way. She didn't regret it entirely. We both knew that, and it complicated everything further. "So where does that leave us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. How could I? There was no guidebook for navigating something like this. We had crossed a line, and now we were left to sift through the aftermath, trying to make sense of the wreckage. I felt my chest tighten, the weight of our situation pressing down on me. The silence that followed was deafening, yet neither of us dared to break it. Finally, I spoke, my words emerging slower than I intended. We can't go back to how things were." "I know," she whispered. "But we can't keep doing this either." The finality in her tone sent a chill down my spine. She was right, of course. We couldn't keep pretending we hadn't crossed that line, nor could we ignore the tension that had built up between us. But acknowledging that reality didn't make it any easier to accept. I stood up, needing to move, needing to release the energy building inside me. I started pacing the room, my thoughts swirling as I searched for a solution that didn't exist. With every step I took, I felt heavier, as if I were sinking into quicksand with no way out. Lila watched me, her gaze tracking my every move. She didn't say anything, but I could sense she was waiting for me to reach the same conclusion she had already come to. Eventually, I halted and turned to face her. "I think we need space," I said, my voice firm, though I felt my heart fracture as I spoke. She nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "I think you're right." We stood in silence, the weight of our decision hanging heavily between us. I wanted to reach out, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but I couldn't. We had already gone too far. The night that followed felt unnaturally quiet after that conversation. It was a silence that wrapped around me, heavy and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. Lila retreated to her room shortly after. We had agreed on needing space, leaving me alone in the living room, staring out at the darkened lake through the wide windows. I could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, each tick seeming to stretch into an eternity. We both knew what needed to happen, but knowing and acting were two entirely different matters. Even after everything we had discussed, I still felt that pull, that tension keeping me anchored to her despite the harsh reality we faced. It was as if our attempts to resist it only made it stronger. I sat there, trying to focus on the passage of time, struggling to keep my thoughts organized. But the confusion and frustration weighed on me, growing heavier with each passing minute. I could no longer endure it without thinking it through. I rose from my chair, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, and headed down the hallway toward Lila's room. My thoughts raced, and my heart thumped heavily in my chest. I had no clue what I would say, nor if this was the right decision to make, yet my feet propelled me forward as if guided by an unseen force. I halted in front of her door, hesitating. The light inside was off, but a faint glow from the bedside lamp seeped under the door. I lifted my hand to knock, but it hovered there momentarily, uncertainty paralyzing me. Was I about to complicate things even further? Maybe we really did need that space. Perhaps everything was too far gone. But then I heard a soft rustling from within. Before I could reconsider, I knocked. There was a brief pause before I heard her voice, quiet and uncertain. Come in. I opened the door slowly, the gentle creak of the hinges breaking the stillness. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her gaze cast downwards. The warm light from the lamp cast a soft glow, making the room feel intimate and small. She didn't look up when I entered, and for a moment I wondered if I should just leave, but I didn't. Instead, I walked over to the armchair by the window and sat down. The space between us felt unbearable, yet I couldn't bring myself to move closer. I can't sleep, I finally said, my voice barely a whisper. It was the only excuse I had for being there, but it wasn't entirely the truth. I hadn't come simply because I couldn't sleep. I was there because I couldn't bear the thought of us drifting apart. Not like this, not after everything we had shared. She nodded, still not meeting my gaze. The silence between us stretched out, heavy with all the unspoken words that hung in the air. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, but I remained still, uncertain about what to do or what she wanted. I've been thinking, she said after what felt like an eternity. Her voice was soft and fragile, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the delicate balance that lingered between us. About what we discussed. About space. I leaned forward in the chair, resting my elbows on my knees, and she exhaled deeply, finally lifting her eyes to mine. I don't know if I can do it, Ethan, she admitted. Her words were gentle yet weighed down with a sense of resignation that settled heavily between us. I don't know if I can just walk away. My heart clenched at her words, hitting me harder than I had anticipated. I felt the same way she did. We had agreed that space was necessary, that we couldn't continue as we were, but the thought of actually separating, of putting distance between us, felt insurmountable. I don't want to walk away either, I confessed, my voice low. But how else can we fix this? Lila stood up, crossing the small distance between us in just a few strides. She stopped in front of me, her expression conflicted, torn between what she knew was right and what her heart yearned for. Maybe it's not about fixing it, she whispered. Maybe it's about accepting it. Her words sent a chill through me. Accepting it? What did that even mean? Did it mean we would remain stuck in this limbo between our desires and our reality? I shook my head, trying to grasp her meaning, but clarity eluded me. Lila, I began, my voice thick with emotion. We crossed a line, and we can't go back from that. I don't know how we're supposed to just accept this. She knelt in front of me, her hands resting on my knees, her eyes brimming with a mixture of sadness and something else I couldn't define. Maybe we don't need to go back, she said softly. Maybe we just let it be what it is. I stared at her, my mind racing, struggling to comprehend. Was this truly what she wanted? To remain in a state where we could never move forward, forever trapped in a chaotic blend of emotions and tension? I can't lose you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Not like this. I can't. My heart ached at the vulnerability in her tone, at the raw emotion reflected in her eyes. I reached out, my hand gently brushing against her cheek, and she leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief moment. I could feel the weight of everything that lay between us, the gravity of the situation drawing us closer even as I recognized it was wrong. I don't want to lose you either, I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. But what are we supposed to do? She opened her eyes, looking up at me with a quiet determination. We stop fighting it. Her words lingered in the air, heavy with significance. I understood what she meant. We had been battling this from the beginning, pretending we could control it, pretending we could make it vanish. But the truth was, no matter how hard we tried, the feelings between us wouldn't simply disappear. I pulled her closer, and for a moment, we simply held one another. The silence enveloped us, no longer stifling but instead filled with a mutual understanding. This wasn't a solution. It wasn't an answer to the tangled situation we found ourselves in. But it was something. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, neither of us speaking. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind outside as the world continued on, while we sat there, entwined in our emotional turmoil. Yet, even as we held each other, as we allowed ourselves to cease fighting the inevitable attraction between us, I knew deep down that this couldn't last. We couldn't remain in this limbo indefinitely. Eventually, something would have to give. The days that followed felt like a strange kind of purgatory. We didn't discuss what had happened that night, but the air between us was charged with a palpable shift. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a quiet agreement to stop resisting the feelings that lingered, even if we couldn't fully define what those feelings were. Lila and I fell back into our routines, preparing breakfast, tending to the garden, and sitting together on the porch in the evenings. But now, each moment crackled with an undercurrent of something unacknowledged. The space between us felt less oppressive, but it didn't feel right either. We weren't resolving anything. We were simply avoiding the inevitable. One evening, about a week later, we found ourselves on the porch as the sun sank lower in the sky, its golden hues giving way to the deep blue of twilight. The lake lay still, the air cool but comfortable. It should have been a tranquil scene, but I sensed the tension creeping back in. We had convinced ourselves that we could navigate this gray area, existing somewhere between denial and acceptance. But deep down, I think we both understood that this wasn't a sustainable existence. I glanced at Lila, her face illuminated by the soft light of the lantern beside her. She gazed out at the lake, her expression distant and contemplative. I wondered what thoughts occupied her mind and if she was as conflicted as I was. I didn't know how to ask her. I wasn't even sure I wanted to know the answer. "I've been thinking," she said suddenly, her voice slicing through the stillness. It was quiet yet resolute, and I could tell from her tone that this conversation was going to be difficult. I shifted in my chair, my heart racing. "About what?" She took a deep breath, her gaze still fixed on the water. "About us. About what we're doing." A knot tightened in my stomach. I had been dreading this moment, knowing it was inevitable. She finally turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a sadness that struck me deeply. "We can't keep pretending this is normal, Ethan. We can't keep going like this." Her words resonated with a truth that felt both undeniable and painful. I swallowed hard, searching for the right response. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, as if trying to find the right way to articulate her thoughts. "I think we need to stop lying to ourselves. We can't keep acting like everything is fine when it's not. We crossed a line, and now we have to figure out what that means." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, final and inescapable. I wanted to argue, to convince her that we could find a way through this, but I knew I would be fooling myself. There was no going back, and moving forward felt just as daunting. It felt like we were trapped in a loop, circling the same problem with no clear solution. "What do we do then?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She shook her head, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "I don't know, but we can't stay here, Ethan. Not like this." The truth of her statement hit me hard, a gut punch I wasn't prepared for. We couldn't remain in this limbo, not just physically but emotionally. Continuing to live in denial wouldn't resolve anything. But the thought of leaving meant confronting the reality of what we had done, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Lila stood up slowly, her movements deliberate as if each step required immense strength. She walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the darkening lake. I stayed seated, frozen by the weight of everything crashing down around me. I wanted to go to her, to reassure her that we could figure it out, that I could make it all right, but I was rooted to the spot. After a long moment, she turned to face me, her expression calm but tinged with resignation. I think it's best if I go back to the city for a while. Maybe some time apart will help us both figure out what we want. The words took me by surprise, even though I should have seen them coming. My chest constricted, panic rising within me. Lila, you don't have to leave. She gave me a small, sad smile. I think I do. For both of us. I stood up, the gravity of her words sinking in. So this is it? You're just going to leave? She nodded, her eyes locked on mine. I think it's the only way, Ethan. I don't know what else to do. A lump formed in my throat. The words I wanted to speak caught somewhere between my heart and my mouth. But what happens to us? Her expression softened for a moment, and I hoped she might change her mind. But instead, she said, I don't know. Maybe it's better if there isn't an US. The finality of her words crashed over me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless. I wanted to protest, to say anything to convince her to stay, but all I could do was stand there, watching as she slowly backed toward the door. I'll pack in the morning, she said quietly, turning away from me. I'll be gone by the afternoon. With that, she stepped inside the house, leaving me alone on the porch, the weight of her words pressing heavily on my chest. The sun had vanished completely, and darkness enveloped me, cold and unforgiving. I remained there for what felt like an eternity, staring out at the lake, trying to comprehend everything that had transpired. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost her, that whatever connection we had, whatever future we might have shared, was slipping through my fingers. The sound of her door clicking shut echoed in my mind, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely isolated. As the wind rustled the trees around me, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the right decision, if this was truly how it had to end. Had we truly ruined everything? Was there another path we could have taken? But the most painful thought, the one that gnawed at me as I stood there in the darkness, was that I might never know the answer.